Karl is an interdisciplinary scholar. He's published in economics, philosophy, politics, sociology, rock music. But Karl is a prominent figure in the UBI movement, co-founder of the US Basic Income Guarantee Network, the Basic Income News website, and has been the co-chair of the Basic Income Earth Network, BN, for 10 years. Had been, not currently. We're very pleased to have Karl here, visiting as the Götz Werner guest professor for the semester. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you. This book, The Prehistory of Private Property, is the second in a series that Grant McCall and I have done, debunking commonly held but false beliefs about prehistoric or non-literate or stateless peoples. These claims are important not just to anthropologists or to academics, but through political philosophy and political theory, these claims have gotten into our society and affect the beliefs that we hold about what institutions are justified in our societies today. Many familiar ideas about why our institutions are supposedly just are based on theories that were developed in the colonial era by people who held beliefs that were filled with colonial prejudices about native peoples. And they based a lot of their claims about what is justified in our society by contrast to their paleo fantasies, their prehistoric myths about people who lived in the deep past, or about how indigenous peoples live now. And our ideas about natural rights and our ideas about the social contract are actually greatly affected by these prehistoric myths that were embedded into our theories hundreds of years ago. And it is really inexcusable that these myths are continued to be believed, because anthropological evidence has been coming out for decades, if not centuries, which, if you look at closely, shows that many of these claims are false. Yet, the political philosophers who are still basing their theories on these claims have not updated their theories with knowledge of what anthropologists have done. They're still making these same claims over and over again, and we couldn't find anyone who had taken the anthropological information and applied it to these theories to debunk these ideas. And so after years of being frustrated that nobody else was doing this, I began some work trying to debunk them myself, which is a bit tough because I have a background in political theory and in economics, but not in anthropology. So I was trying to learn anthropology just by reading books. But luckily, as I was working, I gave a presentation and met an anthropologist, Grant McCall, who respected my work enough to want to work with me and had been writing some similar things. And that gave us an advantage, because it's not two philosophers trying to debunk philosophy or two anthropologists, but it is one philosopher and one anthropologist, so that we have good information about both fields of theory. We bring together expertise in political theory and political philosophy and in anthropology. So I was able to check my claims when I say, well, this is my impression as a lay reader of anthropology. This is my impression of the anthropological literature. I was able to discuss this with Grant McCall and find out whether I was correct or not. And so we set about looking at these claims. And in the course of 2 books, we focused on 4 prehistoric myths that we decided we needed to debunk. Those are, the first we call the Hobbesian hypothesis, or the mutual advantage hypothesis. That is the belief that either the government we have now or the private property rights system that we have now benefits everyone relative to the alternative. If we didn't have any government, even though the government's not perfect, one of the main tenets of anybody who tries to justify an existing government with social contract theory will say, well, the government's not perfect, doesn't share things everywhere, but everything would be so terrible if we didn't have a government that we're all better off than that. So it is a baseline justification. Well, how do they know this? How do they know that everyone benefits? And if you look in the literature, you find that they have very little evidence. Most people, when they make this claim, will treat it as common knowledge. As we all know, we're all better off, given that we have this great property rights system, when we have a government. We're all better off than we would be if we were stateless hunter-gatherers with no government. But to say that we're all better off would mean that the least advantaged individual, the homeless person living under a bridge along the river here, is better off than an indigenous person that fished for giant sturgeon that would have lived in the rivers in this area that are now all extinct and would have been able to drink water right out of the river because it was clean back then. And do we really know that these people are better off? And it is not something that can be treated as obvious, because it's not something in our everyday experience. Most of us really don't know what it's like to be a homeless person in Germany or the United States. We don't know what it's like to be a sweatshop person in Jakarta or Sao Paulo. And we certainly don't know what it was like to live in an indigenous society before colonialists got there and started establishing state governments and private property systems. Yet we treat it as obvious. Why do we treat it as obvious? Because everybody else treats it as obvious. And you go back, who are they citing? Who says that this is so? And you go back in a chain and you find John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. John Locke attempting to justify the private property rights system with what is now called the Lockean proviso, saying we can create property as long as it makes everybody better off. And of course it does, because the lowliest day labor in London in the 1600s was supposedly so much better off than one of those naked savages in America. And Locke says, earlier in time, all the world was America. And Hobbes says a similar thing about the government, that if we didn't have a government, we'd all be at each other's throats. Look at and he specifically says those North Americans live today in that brutish manner because they have no government to keep the peace. Well, those are just the colonial musings of 2 armchair anthropologists, that what information they had about native peoples was coming from the prejudices of colonial writers. People who had gone out and made war on took land from the natives and took land from the natives and then wondered why the natives were making war on them. And then said, oh, they must be warlike. They don't like us taking their land. They make war on us. They must be a warlike people. They don't see what a great benefit it is we're giving to them. Those were just colonial prejudices. Yet, they've embedded ourselves in our justification of the property rights system and our justification of the very government. So in the first book, which is called Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy, it is dedicated to debunking this Hobbesian hypothesis, we call it, this mutual advantage hypothesis. This belief that modern institutions are actually a benefit to everyone. And we go through rather meticulously looking at the different ways you could say that someone is better or worse off, and find that there is very little evidence to support this and very good evidence to say this claim is false. The least advantaged among us would actually be better had they been born into an indigenous society without a private property rights system and without a sovereign government. They would not live as long in that sense. They would not have the same average life expectancy. But they actually, in the time that Hobbes and Locke were writing, and in many countries well through the late 20th century, their lifespan would have been just as long. And it hasn't, the increase in lifespan has still not filtered down to the least off people in the least off countries today. And even then, we are longer lived, but not healthier in all ways. Many of the things that indigenous people died of, we've cured. And many of the things that made them sick, like snake bites and animal attack and accidents, we don't have problems with. But they don't die from very much cancer because they don't have toxins in their food, in their environment. If you die young of cancer, you very well might have been better off. But long life is not all there is to better off. In many native societies, you have robust social systems where people feel a part of a community. Alienation that many of us feel in the modern society, the teen angst and the kind of thing that inspires violence within our society is often absent in, or much less common in indigenous societies. The myth that they are necessarily violent is just that, a myth. There are some very violent indigenous societies that have been witnessed, but there are also many extremely nonviolent. States that have been, stateless societies that have been observed. And the suicide rate in stateless societies is extremely low. So actually in many of them, the violent death rate, which is the murder rate plus the suicide rate, is actually lower than in many of our societies. And if you were to add all the people who die early due to toxins in their food and in their environment, if we counted those as a form of homicide, which they are, an accidental homicide, but a homicide nevertheless, the violent death rate is not necessarily better. Another way in which native peoples, indigenous peoples who live in stateless societies with common property regimes are better off is in terms of freedom. That's supposed to be one of the big advantages of our societies. You're supposed to be free, but if you find that you're free to do just about anything you have the money to do, Oh, but most of us start off life without any money, and then we have to go and take orders from somebody. 30 or 40 hours a week, 3, 4, 5 decades of our lives. We end up taking orders from somebody over and over again just to get the resources to keep us alive. Whereas people in stateless societies with common property very often don't have to take orders from anyone. Can go through their lives without hearing somebody say, do this, and expect it to be done. So we have delivered people both poverty and freedom. We've raised the opportunity. The advantage in our society is in opportunity. It is not in freedom. It is an opportunity. We've created great opportunities, but the opportunities are not widely shared. And at the same time that we've created these great opportunities, we've lowered the floor. We've lowered the floor so you have a chance of being much worse off than you could in one of these societies. And that we have not done enough. We've done wrong, and we have done wrong to the least advantage in our societies. And a society, the word for a society that does not achieve mutual advantage is parasitic. We are not a mutual advantage society. We are a parasitic society. One that makes those of us who have the better opportunities better off than we would be otherwise. And those of us who don't, worse off. Yet, I don't think from the information we found in that first book that you can make a very good case for anarchy, because there is no evidence we found that it is impossible for our societies to make everyone better off. We have simply chosen not to. We have the ability, we produce so much, we have the ability to make everyone better off. We've got to find some way to make them as free as they would be in another society, some way to get them the power to say no to people who would make them take orders all their lives, but still leave them free for the opportunity to do that if that's going to make them better off. We would need to treat people a lot better. And that also connects to how these claims are used. This claim about everyone being better off in life today has been used since the 1600s, both against low-class people in European societies and the European settler communities like the United States and Australia, and to justify colonialism. If everybody's so much better off in our type of society, then it's okay for us to go and take over the whole world and make all these people better off. The white man's burden, the civilizing mission of the white people, well, it was based on a false premise. But also it is used against people so it's used to take land from natives and to mistreat people in European societies. And it is a false claim, yet you will hear it over and over again. We talk about, in the book, we go through many modern literature that repeats this claim over and over again, that the proviso is fulfilled, mutual advantage is achieved. Hobbes and Locke were right. So that's what we do in the first book. In the second book, we address 3 more claims. That's in the book, The Prehistory of Private Property. In that, we address the inequality hypothesis, what we call the inequality hypothesis, the market freedom hypothesis, and the natural property rights hypothesis. The inequality hypothesis is the belief that a more equal society, a society that lacks very strong hierarchy or social stratification, strong inequalities of wealth, power, property rights, and privilege and so on, that such a society, either it cannot exist or it can only exist at a great expense of freedom. That last version of it is a new take on it. The one that, well, yeah, maybe you can have equality, but only if you make people very unfree, is what they will say. And we look at the history of this claim. If you look at people making this claim, as we do, going back to ancient China, we find that you get wide agreement in almost every society you can find, a widely believed claim that inequality, that equality is impossible, and that that inequality is natural and inevitable. But you'll also find wide disagreement about why. What type of inequality is natural and inevitable? The ancient Egyptians believed that the Pharaoh was God incarnate on earth, and it was, of course, only natural for God to be unequal among everyone else. The ancient Romans believed that the ancient Romans and Greeks believed that the barbarian races were natural slaves. And the barbarian races this time were Northern Europeans, who later decided they were the civilized ones and others were natural slaves. And they were Northern Europeans and people from south of the area. They were in both sides. And there were other people who were unequal for various reasons. The three great Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all based on the equality of all believers. And that presents a problem for the natural inequality hypothesis, but they all manage to get around it pretty quickly, one way or another. And they got around, there's two ways to get around it. One is to say that, well, the natural equality of all believers is true, but there's a natural inequality between the believers and the non-believers. As long as people remain non-believers, we can treat them unequally. But another way they got around it was a claim that was very popular through the Middle Ages, which was the idea of the great chain of being. The belief that all bodies, all beings in the world, in the universe, were ordered perfectly from the highest to the lowest. There was a natural order, not just among the species, from God to the angels to the humans, and so to the higher animals, the lower animals, and the minerals, and so on. Not only among all of those, but within each of the species, that all of us would have a hiring. So the king and the upper class are closer to God than the lower classes, and they have a natural right to command, and they would not be in command if God had not chosen them. God had chosen them for command. We have an upper class because, well, clearly God must want us to have an upper class or he would change it. And the equality of all believers is something that is relegated solely to Judgment Day. And then you get, and people have a natural station in life, and one of your roles as a believer is to follow that station in life. In the modern period, you get people like Thomas Hobbes, who I mentioned before, Thomas Hobbes saying that well, people are naturally equal in the state of nature, but we need inequality for functional reasons. We need a king to be in charge. And therefore, we have to have enormous inequality between the king and everyone else. As a matter of fact, we should give him life or death power over everyone else. It's only natural. It's the only way to keep the peace. John Locke starts a line of reasoning into the idea that there is a conflict between freedom and inequality. A conflict between freedom and equality. He equates property rights with freedom. And said, well, if you have property rights makes you free, then trading those property rights is going to lead to equality. You cannot be free if we don't have inequality. And you get other things that come along there. There was a thing called the head in the hand analogy, which was when they were trying to look for sort of scientific arguments for inequality, where they say, well, there's some people who are like head people. They think. They're the idea people. And other people are like hands. They don't think very well, but they're very good at doing. And so the head people will actually have to command the hand people. And that, at least in this theory, everyone works together. And one came along that was worse than that, which was the eugenics idea, which is kind of based on this same sort of biological inequality, but it was more like the head people really didn't need the hand people at all. We should just breed them out. Which was, of course, worked very well with beliefs about racial inequality, which were gaining huge amount of power at the time, as Europeans and their settler descendants were conquering the world and looking for good justifications why they should be able to do that. Racism was one. The value of their institutions was another. And so we have been trying to jettison these outright racist ideas from our thinking with limited success, but these other ideas of a conflict between freedom and equality remain in there. But actually, if you look at societies without private property rights, or with very, very limited private properties, there are societies that have been witnessed by anthropology where you really don't have a secure property of much of anything beyond your body. If you have two spears and somebody else doesn't have one, and you try not to share, you will be basically ostracized by the community. You can take your two spears and go off and live by yourself in the woods, but somebody might come and take one of your spears anyway. And where there is, and so very little property in goods. If you have just enough for yourself in most societies, that's fine. That is, in fact, yours. But if you have more than you need, many societies will ostracize you if you will not share. And in really the most important of all aspects of property, land, you'll find many indigenous communities that have no state and are nomadic hunting and gathering communities, which is a very small portion of the indigenous communities at the time of colonial contact. But there were some, and there are a few that remain today. And this institution, this way of life was extremely common thousands of years ago. Every society that lives like that, nomadic hunters and gatherers, has had no private property inland at all, that is shared at least among everyone in the community. And sometimes between everybody. You don't even have to be a member of the community. And you find that societies where there is very limited or no private property rights system at all, certainly not a capitalist market economy that we're all familiar with and supposed to be the embodiment of freedom. you'll find actually freedom in the negative sense is extremely strong. As I've said before, people can go through their whole lives without having to hear someone take an order. They do not have to ask somebody's permission to go out and fish and farm and hunt and gather. And farmers, very often, many farming societies also do not have private property and land. You find people in these societies are very free from taking orders from anyone. The idea of an Indian chief who lords it over everyone else might be drawn from some of the larger scale Native American communities, but is really not true of the small-scale farming and hunting and gathering societies. So you find in this negative sense, freedom from taking someone else's orders. Our society doesn't do a very good job at all. If you don't own any land, anything you might do to preserve your own life without taking someone else's orders is illegal, except for maybe hunting in garbage cans or begging. Hunting and gathering in garbage cans, a type of modern foraging. So the inequality hypothesis, the freedom hypothesis, and the last one is what takes up most of the second book, The Prehistory of Private Property. That is the natural property hypothesis. The idea that private property as we know it is a natural right. That it is something that people naturally create, that governments do not create it, that governments interfere with it, that governments and collectives and ethnic groups and communities do not own property, or do not have joint claims to land that are valid. Only individuals, or perhaps the corporations or cooperatives they might create, only they own property. And this is a natural right that any thinking person would create, no matter where, when, or how they lived. And the only reason it does not exist everywhere, and the only reason that there's so much taxation, regulation, and redistribution of private property is because governments have usurped this right. I'm sure you have all heard this claim. It was made, this also goes back to John Locke, but John Locke wasn't as strict as many of his followers. Many of his followers today will portray virtually all taxation, regulation, and redistribution of private property as some horrible infringement on the natural rights of human beings. And this is something that they also have very poor evidence for. When people saying, how do you justify this natural right of private property? Usually, people will tell a story. They'll tell a myth. They'll tell a prehistoric myth, a paleo fantasy. They'll tell a story that was told by John Locke, and I think he got a version of it from Grotius, an earlier philosopher, that where a man, and it's presumed to be a man, goes out in the woods, and it's virgin land, and he chops down the trees and creates a farm. And then, by creating the farm, mixes his labor with the land and makes the land more valuable. The land was virtually worthless before that. Almost all of what's coming out of that land is coming from the man's labor. And therefore, he has, having mixed his valuable thing, his labor, with this virtually worthless thing, land, takes a natural right to own it and will naturally want to own that as an individual private property holder. And he will want to leave it to his son, who will want to leave it to his son, or maybe sell it to some other guy, or maybe if all the males die, maybe then a woman would inherit it for a while till she had a son. And this was eventually, that part they've gone a ways to trying to get that part out and say, okay, it doesn't have to be a man, it could be a woman too, they could leave it to women, okay, they could buy and sell it with women, okay, women, we'll include them. So that is simply what people naturally do, they will tell you. And governments don't do that. Governments just come along and pretend to represent the people, and they will take this away. And they will say, the right to this land among the people who tell these kind of stories, what gives you the right sometimes varies. In Locke's story, it was the mixing of the labor. Because you used your labor and you mixed it with something that wasn't very valuable to begin with and gave it value, that's why you own it. But other people will say, well, you own it because you were the first one to use it. If I'm using something nobody else has used before, then it's mine. Or some will say first claim. Well, finders keepers. I see it as mine. It's fine, as that's first claim. And some will say discovery. If you discover something that no one else has discovered, which could be that there was this ugly black stuff that used to bubble up out of the ground in some places. And nobody ever liked it. It gets you dirty. Nobody wanted to be around it. It's this worthless thing. Somebody found out, oh, that's oil, and you can make gasoline out of that, and it's hugely valuable. Suddenly, this thing becomes valued. You discover, so it's not just discovering where something is located, but discovering the value in something thought to be valueless. People will say this. So you have first labor, first use, first claim, discovery. All is given for reasons why private property is a natural right. It's what any thinking person, if they really thought about it, would want. And usually the story ends there. Maybe they'll cite Friedrich Hayek, who cites 3 anthropologists who will say a little something that might make you think this is true, unless you check his sources, which we have, and none of them back up his claim. Well, that's what they say, but what really happened? If this is so true, if this is true, if rights are a natural right, in this property rights are a natural right, and the only way they don't exist is when governments interfere with them, then if we look at the prehistory of private property, the time before the establishment of this capitalist market economy we have now, the origin and development of this system we have now, if we look at that time, all through history, what we should see is constant. We know that we never had a right libertarian paradise that had all the laws that libertarians want, but if we don't, it must be because there would be continually thwarted attempts of individuals trying to establish an individual private property system. And then they would be thwarted by these kings or elected governments or anyone else who wanted to interfere with them to establish something else, some more collective sort of property. That's what we should see if we look back at the origin and development of private property. Well, and that's what basically the second half of this book looks at, that origin and development of private property. We look at first at small-scale nomadic hunter-gatherers who live in communities of usually less than 60 people, sometimes as few as maybe 10 adults and more children, sometimes more, who are nomadic and consume food basically as soon as they get it. A nomad is not necessarily an aimless wanderer. They're usually people that are nomadic within a range. They move around the year looking for, at this time of year, usually there's good hunting and gathering here, and then we move over here. We move around within a range that we are familiar with. we look at these kind of communities with both evidence from contemporary ethnography, from people who have gone and lived with communities who live in this manner, and comparing that to archaeological information of people who lived in a similar manner tens of thousands of years ago or more. And we start with this group because this is believed to be the oldest form of social political organization, that the earliest people sort of lived in this way, and later they started developing techniques that allowed them to live at larger scales and to settle into one place, to do that, to settle in one place very often and develop a larger scale community, you often need to invent something like knowing when the fish are running or something like that. But there probably have been larger scale communities coming and going for a very long time. But for a very long time, in the 300,000 years that the human species has been around here, people were living in this style. And I've already said what type of property system these groups tend to have. These groups who are the people who tend to establish the first claim, the first people to use land, the first people to claim land, the people who discovered land on all 6 of the inhabited continents, depending on how you're counting them, all 6 of the inhabited continents and many of the islands, where hunter-gatherers were there first. So discovery, first use, first claim, all of those put the nomadic hunter-gatherers as the first comers. Now, but in Locke's terms, but Locke kind of had some inkling about this, so he specifically tried to write them out. And that's where this first labor mixing came with. What do we say? Well, a hunter mixes his labor with the deer, but not with the land on which he killed the deer, because the land is the same as before. The deer is more valuable. A dead deer you can eat. Can't eat a live deer. So he's made the deer more valuable, but the land hasn't changed at all. And so this was used to try to write out the hunting territories of North Americans. Most North Americans were in fact farmers, but actually most of their land was dedicated to hunting. So even if he respected their farming rights, which I don't think he did, they would still lose most of their land rights by this. But this, well, for one thing, even in terms of labor mixing, these groups have claimed to be the original appropriators of property, because they did many things to change the land, including, say, hunting the woolly rhinoceros to death, hunting the saber-toothed tiger to death, hunting the cave bear to death, but also very often managing forests and building weirs in streams in order to catch fish and so forth. Many things they did altered the environment. Some of those things might have been mistakes, but a lot of things modern capitalists are doing are mistakes too. Maybe that whole taking that oil and make it into gasoline wasn't such a great idea in retrospect. I'm not sure with the global warming. So even in those terms, they had the first claim, but yet the idea was anyone who would do one of these appropriative acts would want to appropriate it as individual private property. Well, do these people establish individual private property? And they do not establish anything like individual private property. Property is not inheritable. Property must be shared. And the land cannot be made into property. The land remains either for the entire community, where everyone, just by being a member of the community, has a right to land, but right to hunt on the land and gather on the land, but not necessarily to any part of it. And or when actually any person whatsoever who wants to hunt and gather there could. The Inuit in northern Canada had no concept that they had any special claim to hunt and gather on the tundra of northern Canada. Anybody from anywhere in the world shows up there in northern Canada, they say, you're gonna go cut a hole in the ice and fish, have at it. We have at it, good luck. It's cold up here. So that's when they say, well, maybe it's farming then. When you get farming, that's when people want to establish private property rights. And again, they're wrong, because what you get in the earliest farming communities, you get a type of agriculture that I call village agriculture. Sometimes it's slash and burn, where they establish a village here and they farm the land until as long as it's good, and then they have to move somewhere else because they deplete the land. But even people who manage land often do this together. Who stay in the same place will have this same sort of communal use of land, which is, if you're a member of the farming village, you do not have special claim to any land. You have a claim, because you're part of the community, to some land. So no, and you cannot leave it, you cannot inherit it, you cannot sell it. It is land you can use because you're part of the community. And all the different farmers in the town talk to each other about when we're going to plant, what we will plant, how we will use this land. And you find that this kind of village agriculture is common all over the world. Anywhere that there was farming, unless it was established just in the last couple hundred years, you will find this kind of, some variation on this, where property rights are complex, they're overlapping, they're flexible, and they're at least partly communal, with a significant common element. That is what people were setting up, and that is what peasants in Europe were still doing before the Enclosure movement. At the time that Locke and Pufendorf and many other people, many other philosophers of the early modern era, were portraying private property as the natural form of property. Actually, the Enclosure movement was happening, and these villages were being converted into, instead of the lord just being sort of a parasitic person that just siphoned some taxes off of them, but didn't really interfere with the way they managed and lived their lives and ran the land, said, oh, well, you've just been my tenants the whole time. What you have is not really ownership rights to the land. What you have is customary rights. Well, your customs aren't that valuable. You're really just tenants. You've been paying me rent all these years anyway. I've been the true owner all along. I am, so now that you're tenants, I'm just going to kick you off, and you can go into the city and get a job. And that was the Enclosure movement, and that was going on as Locke was writing, and he knew it. So private property does not begin in prehistory. It does not begin with the first people to discover, claim, or use land. It does not begin with the first people to farm land. When does it begin? Well, of these armchair philosophers, Hobbes got a lot of things wrong, as I've said, but this is one thing he got right in his imaginings. Locke said that private property was natural. Hobbes said that private property stems from the arbitrary will of the sovereign. If you look at the establishment of private property, so the first property that you can really say this is private, it's not held on behalf of the community as a whole, you have to go back to the ancient Near East, in Sumeria and Egypt, and it's only in the later periods where you get something that is recognizable of private property. And it starts not from individuals going out into the woods and saying, this is mine and my children will inherit it, but you get the king saying, well, the palace is special. I don't just hold this on behalf of this is mine. And then maybe his family, some high officials, they'll want something that's theirs too. It filters down from the top. The king establishes, it goes to members of the royal family and others, and it happens gradually over hundreds or thousands of years, so that by the time of the Enclosure movement, and we go in much more detail in the book, by the time of the Enclosure movement, the areas that have something truly recognizable as private property are in some of the cities and very little of the countryside, either in Europe or in the rest of the world. We're still living in a society where village agriculture or common hunting and gathering areas, even if they're being used by people who are part-time or largely farmers, are still the most common land right that there is in the world. Then a twin movement begins. The Enclosure movement in Europe, where they kick the peasants off the land and say, this has been owned by the Lord all along. You can stay here and pay rent, but you'll have to do whatever the landlord says. If he wants all of it to be one crop, all of it will be one crop. No more of this village getting together and deciding that they'll raise things that they can consume here. We will raise things for sale. I will pay you cash. You will buy it. You will buy other things you want somewhere else. We have the Enclosure movement in Europe, and we have the colonial movement around the rest of the world. So you find the very opposite of what the natural rights justification of private property holds. Instead of a history where people are continually trying to establish private property rights and governments are interfering with it, you have people who are establishing community property rights where we share the land and we talk about how to use it. And we have people from the top down creating a private property rights system to benefit the elite, and many times very specifically to control not only the land. When you control the land, you control something that is even more valuable than the land. That is the labor of everyone who doesn't have land. And we have plenty of quotes from during the Enclosure movement of people saying one of the reasons we need this Enclosure movement is because these peasants won't work for us. They're asking for too much money. They're lazy. They're lazy because people who farm their own land were considered lazy, because they wouldn't work for cash when the upper class wanted it to. So by creating this system, we've created a system where the 99% of us cannot live without going and getting a job and following somebody's orders for most of our life. And by the time we save up enough money that we don't have to follow somebody's orders, we're often too old to work anyway. That is a system that has been established by government interference with people who are sharing out resources and had complex, flexible, overlapping property rights with very significant common or communal elements to them. That is a brief summary of the prehistory of private property. That's the barest advertisement, if you will, for the book. If you're interested in the details of this story and its implications for the world today, I suggest you read the book. I found it so interesting compiling all of this. And the lessons we draw from this is that our justifications for the institutions that we have don't work. Inequality, social stratification, severe hierarchy is not necessary. That it does not come at the expense of freedom. It can. I mean, there's some people that will promise you equality and deliver you slavery. You've got to look out for those people. But it is possible to have a much more equal society than we have, and to be a very free society. We have the freest societies we've ever witnessed have also been the most equal societies we've ever witnessed. That there's nothing natural in this right to property. It has been forced on us by the whim of the sovereign. And the system we've created doesn't do that barest thing that even its proponents say it needs to do to justify itself. It doesn't benefit everyone. We've got to change the society in a way that is going to make the least advantage of us freer. I argue that, and Grant McCall, my co-author, does as well, that one of the things we need to restore that is the power for the lower class to refuse to take orders from the upper class. And that's not done by seizing the means of production and giving it to some new form of upper class. But it's done by giving every individual the power to say no, which could be done by giving them direct access to resources or in-kind goods or through a basic income. We need to make sure that we need to clean up our environment so that we're not poisoning people. We're not killing the environment that sustains us. And we simply need to treat the less advantaged people of this world better. We need to make sure they have better welfare and that they're freer than they are now. That is what we argue in these two books. And I'm glad to discuss this with you now.